Pottery is one of the oldest crafts, dating back to the dawn of human civilization. And yet, for all that time, except for the last 15 minutes, potters have been digging and processing their own wild clay. And yet today, it's practically a lost art because we've been spoiled from buying our clay at the store. And so, let's spend a few minutes exploring the age-old craft of finding, digging, and processing your own wild clay. Clay is a lot like toilet paper and dog food. These are all things we'd have trouble living without if they stopped selling them at the store. And yet, 100 years ago, none of these items were widely available commercially. In those days, most people made their own. In fact, it wasn't until the last 70 or 80 years, basically our grandparents' or great-grandparents' lifetimes, that these items became widely available off the shelf. The question of how to make your own dog food or what to wipe your butt with is a subject for a different YouTuber in a different video. But in this video, I'm going to show you how to find, harvest, and process your own clay, just like our ancestors did up until my grandfather's day. So you've seen me digging the clay. The question is, how do I know this is clay? So you see this crackled texture in here? That tells me that the soil here has a high clay content. Also, you see these car tracks? A place where somebody drove a car down this road when it was wet. And then after it dried, it held onto those tracks. That's also a good clue that there's a lot of clay in this soil. So when I get to my next stop, I'm going to explain all of this in more detail. Okay, let's first talk a little bit about what clay is. Clay is the smallest particle of soil, and as such, it's found everywhere on Earth. So that's good. Also, the particles of clay, the individual particles, are not only small, they're flat, they're plate-like. Now, the size of those particles, that's what helps make it plastic. That's why it adheres to itself, because there are bonds between those individual particles because they're so close together. And so that gives it plasticity. That makes it very moldable. That's one of the things that makes clay very useful. The other good thing about clay in nature is that it stays suspended in water. Those tiny flat particles will stay suspended in water for a long time. So when water falls on the mountains and rushes down the rivers and creeks down towards the ocean, it carries with it sediment that it picks up as it crosses the land. Bits of rock, gravel, sand, silt, and clay, and it carries them down. Now, as it first starts coming down, it might be carrying everything, including big rocks. But those rocks are going to settle out while the water is still moving relatively quickly, so along the mountains, in steep areas. And that's why creeks in or near the mountains are often full of rocks. As that water starts to slow down and move less quickly, it's going to start settling smaller and smaller particles. So you might first start seeing more gravel, and then as the ground gets flatter, sand. Finally, you might start settling out silt, but that clay is going to stay through all those areas until that water gets really slow and it can really set for a while, and that clay will start settling out. So places like river or creek floodplains, places where that water kind of spreads out over a wide area and moves very slowly, those are places where clay naturally accumulates. Also, the bottoms of ponds or lakes, the bottoms of the ocean. Now, you're not going to get a scuba outfit and go down at the bottom of an ocean or a lake and collect clay. That's not practical. But you can find clay anywhere. You can find clay on top of a mountaintop because maybe the stones on that mountaintop used to be the bottom of an ancient seabed or the bottom of an ancient lake. And once those clays are accumulated like they do, then they'll stay there forever. And so looking along the sides of a creek, any place where you see that horizontal strata, that is places where sediments have been laid down by that creek or river over the course of a long time. And that's a great place to look. But not all of that material is clay. A lot of it can be silt or sand. So you have to do some testing. You have to look for the qualities of clay. One of those is that plasticity. Is it plastic? If it's not plastic when you find it, get it wet. Knead it in your hands. Is it plastic now? See if you can roll a little coil of clay and wrap it around your finger. If you can do that, if you can form a little coil and wrap it around your finger without it cracking, then that tells you you've got clay. Another one of the unique properties of clay is that it's expansive. That is, when it gets wet, it expands. When it dries, it shrinks. And that causes these crackles, that crackled texture that you might be used to seeing on the bottom of a dried mud puddle. That shows there's clay in that material. So if you keep your eyes looking for that crackled texture, you'll start finding clay a lot of places you go. So the two main things you're looking for when you're out in nature looking for clay, that crackled texture, that evidence that the material is expansive, right? And the plasticity, that the holding it in your hand and seeing if it's plastic, if you can mold it to different shapes without it cracking. Now you might live someplace where it's damp all the time and you don't get that crackled texture. You're still gonna start feeling it in your hands for that plasticity. That's gonna be the main thing that's gonna tell you something. Now, what kind of places are good for looking for clay? Well, obviously anywhere on earth is a good place to look for clay, but you might live in a city or a neighborhood where there's not a lot of places that you can look for clay. I live in a city of Tucson, Arizona, and there used to be a lot of really beautiful pottery made there hundreds of years ago. And most of that clay, all of that clay really, came from right there in Tucson. And yet it's almost impossible to find good clay in Tucson today. And that's because all the good places all have parking lots built on them, or office buildings, or roads, or just concrete over the dirt to kind of keep it from eroding. When I talk to old timers, they often tell me, oh, there used to be some good clay over here, or I used to dig clay over there. And you go there today and there's just no access to it, or there's a no trespassing sign or something. So just because there is clay doesn't mean it's a good place to look for clay. So sometimes you have to kind of get out of the city. And then a good place to look is along roadsides. So these cuts in roads, places where the road goes through and they've cut into a little hill, that's a great place to look because it cuts into the earth and you can often see that horizontal strata and you can take a look at it and see if it's clay. Also, roadsides, people don't tend to worry too much about you digging a bucket of clay on the side of a road. Whereas if you're in a farmer's field, you know, somebody might come yell at you, right? Construction sites are another good place to look if you live in a city, because at a construction site, they're naturally digging the soil up. And it might be a good idea to just talk to one of the construction workers, get permission. Often it's okay. They don't mind if you take a little bit of the dirt from there. Really, when people say, where is clay found? The answer is clay is found where you find it. Clay can be found almost anywhere, in the mountains, in the valleys, on the sides of roads, all over the place. Keep your eyes peeled. Once you identify a few clay sources, you're going to start seeing it everywhere you go. Okay, I've got a couple of good clays that I'm going to take home and process, and I'll show you that process. So let's head back there, but on the way I want to stop a couple places and show you some different sorts of clay, because I think it's really going to help you to see different kinds of clay in the field. That'll help you get an idea of what it looks like and identify clay for yourself. A dirt road is a great place to look for clay because you can see the soil and the way that soil has reacted to things like rain or tracks, you know, car tracks or animal tracks can tell you a lot about the quality of it, how much clay there is in it. So if you see car tracks or animal tracks that have been pushed up by the wet soil and stay there, sand or silt will not act like that. It will push up, but then it will quickly crumble because it doesn't have that stick-togetherness that clay gives it. So keep your eyes peeled, drive some back roads. If the ground holds onto those tracks for a period of time, that tells you there's a lot of clay in it. You think being out here hiking and driving all over this beautiful country looking for wild clay is easy? It's not. I make it look easy, but it's really a horrible burden to be out here in these wide open spaces all day. You're definitely better off at home watching videos on the internet. But if you are a glutton for punishment like I am, and want to become a primitive pottery martyr like me, then there's no better ways to learn the ins and outs than through the Ancient Potters Club. Every week, Ancient Potters Club members get a brand new live video class with me, all experience levels welcome. Full recordings of every class I've ever taught, hundreds of hours going back years. Instant access to my 4 complete online masterclasses: wild clay, coil building, natural pigments, and outdoor firing. A worldwide community of potters who are just as obsessed about primitive pottery as I am. You can learn more about the Ancient Potters Club and even get a 7-day free trial by going to my website, ancientpottery.how. But just know this, that if you join, you are likely to find yourself out here hiking around the hills looking for clay, or maybe firing pottery in the great outdoors, getting lots of sunshine and exercise and who knows what else. You are definitely better off at home, where the chairs are more comfortable and the snacks are nearby. This is what I was wanting to show you. Pure clay, really pure layers of clay, often break into these angular chunks. Has a certain way of breaking that when you see it, once you learn what it looks like, you recognize as clay. So sometimes when you see these angular chunks that are shaped like this, it just tells you that that's clay. This behind me is a great example of a road cut with a lot of clay in it. This is actually a lacustrine deposit. That means a lake bed deposit. So millions of years ago, this whole valley had a big lake in it. And so there's layers and layers of clay and other sediments in this valley. Later on, that lake washed out and now a river flows through here. There's no lake, and that is exposed all these layers all over the valley. But this is a great place to collect clay because it's right on a roadside. It's easy to get to. Nobody cares if you dig a bucket of clay. And there's a lot of good clay here. So how do I know this is clay? First of all, that crackled texture that we see on the surface. And secondly, those angular chunks that we can see when we dig into it. We could always get some wet and do that plasticity test I showed you earlier as well. All right, I have two different kinds of clay to process now. That is, I'm turning the soil type clay into the crafting material clay, which is slightly different. Like a lot of things we do, there's a million ways to skin that cat. That is, processing clay. But primarily, there are two main ways that we process clay, and that is the dry method and the wet method. The dry method is faster, but the wet method has its strengths as well. The wet method takes longer to do, but you make that time up if you're processing a great volume of clay, or if you have a lot of impurities that you have to remove from that clay before you can use it. Because the dry process assumes that that clay is relatively pure. It doesn't remove any impurities. So let's get started on the wet process first, because that's going to take longer. And then when I get that kind of going on its own, then I'm going to come back here and do the dry processing. For the wet method, we're going to need a couple of things. First of all, these paint strainer bags, you can pick these up at just about any hardware store. And these are great. They're kind of like cheesecloth. They're very fine strainer. And you can pour that liquid clay through it and it'll take out most of those impurities. The other thing you're going to need is an old pillowcase that you don't mind getting dirty, and another bucket. The first step in wet processing clay is getting the clay, wait for it, wet. So I'm just going to cover it with water. I'm going to let it sit here for an hour or two and just kind of soak that up before I do anything else with it. Dry processing clay is pretty straightforward. We just have to turn this material we collected out in the field into a powder. And so to do that, I like to use this little corn grinder. Now these are pretty common in Mexico. They're used to turn corn, the grain, into cornmeal. And they're just hand cranked, they're cast iron, and because they're built so sturdily out of cast iron, they work really good for clay and rocks and all kinds of things. So you just put the material in the hopper and you turn the crank and it grinds it up and the powdered clay comes out here. And you can adjust it using this knob on the front to control how fine you want it ground. Pretty handy thing. You can get these online for about 40 or 50 bucks in the United States. They are incredibly hard to find if you live in Europe or someplace else. Now, if you don't have a corn grinder, don't worry, because in a minute I'm going to show you a couple alternative ways to turn your clay into powder. This isn't the only way to do it. Another way to grind that clay into powder is using the age-old method of a grinding stone, sometimes called a metate. Now you can sometimes find these in antique stores. They're not going to be cheap. Also, new ones are still being made in Mexico, and those run about $100 and up. So I will be putting links down in the doobly-doo to everything, the corn grinder, the metate, etc. So you can look down there if you are interested in buying one of these. And the function of these is pretty simple. I don't think I really need to explain it. Put the material on here, Run the hand stone or the mono over it, turn it into powder. And the last one I'm going to show you, that's just making an ad hoc metate out of what you have around. In this case, I'm using a brick and another brick, but you could use like a patio or a driveway, you know, a piece of concrete, whatever you have, you know, a rock, and just crush that clay up. It's going to be a little slower than either the actual metate or the corn grinder, but you can get it done pretty easily. And if you're not making a whole lot of clay at once, you can make enough for one pot pretty quickly. Okay, I've got enough of this red clay ground up now to make a pot, so I'm ready to move on to the next step. Believe it or not, I'm not ready to add the water yet. I need to add something called temper. Now, I know it seems counterintuitive, but temper is actually non-plastic material. Things like sand that are added into the clay to help keep it from cracking, both in the drying and the firing. So we've taken all this time to find good, pure clay. Now we're adding sand and impurity back into it. But it is an important step. If you leave that out, your pots are unlikely to survive. The amount of temper is going to vary depending on the clay. As a general standard rule, I usually shoot for about 20% temper by volume to wild clay, especially clays that I haven't tested yet. Now, once I start using it, I might decide it needs more or less. How am I going to know that? If I add 20% temper and I find that the clay is just unworkable, it's lacking in plasticity, I may cut back on that temper. If I add 20% temper and I still have trouble with drying cracks or thermal shock cracks in the firing, then I may realize that I need to add more temper. Some clays are not going to be useful for making pottery. You may find that by the time I've added enough temper to keep it from cracking, it's no longer plastic. Or you may find that by the time you've taken out enough temper to make it plastic, now it just cracks all the time. So every clay is going to be different, and not every clay is going to be actually usable. And you're going to have to play each one by ear. But 20% is a good place to start. So if I'm adding 20% by volume, I'm going to do 4 scoops of this red powdered clay to 1 scoop of sand. Now, other things you can use if you don't have access to sand. Sand is easy for me because I live in the desert. There's quite a bit of sand around me, but not everybody has that luxury. Beach sand is not a good source of temper material because beach sand is loaded with bits of seashells, which are calcium carbonate. Calcium carbonate is also in things like limestone. These are what you want to avoid in your temper because these will cause pops, calcium spalls in your pottery. Other things you can use include volcanic ash, diatomaceous earth, which is pretty easily accessible in most hardware stores. Ground stone. Certain stones that are soft can be run through your corn grinder just like you did the clay. Run it through a screen to remove any large particles and add it as temper. Ground up pottery sherds. So if you've got some old pots that didn't make it or don't look too good, you can bust those into small bits. Again, run them through your corn grinder or grind them on your metate and then add those as temper. There's a lot of things you can use. I'm going to use sand here. Okay, so there you have it. A nice little block of red clay. That's enough to make a decent sized pot. Now, what you want to do is you can use this now, but it's only going to get better over time, especially in the first 24 hours or so. So wrap it up in a plastic bag, add a little water to it, and it'll continue to drink up that water for a few hours yet and become more and more plastic. So letting it rest 24 hours and soak up a little bit of water is a good idea. I'm putting holes in it and then I'll pour the water into those holes. That way the water can sit there and kind of soak into the clay really good. And then when I come back tomorrow or the next day to actually use it, it's going to be a lot more plastic, a little softer than it is now. Should be a pretty decent clay. Now that that white clay has soaked for a couple of hours, I need to just mix it up. I use a drill and a paint stirrer to do this, which just makes it easier, but you don't have to have that. You can mix this up with your hands just as well. Once it's all mixed up, it's time to strain the impurities out of it. For this straining, you don't want it to be too thick, otherwise it's just going to gum up in those pores. You want that clay to be fairly thin. I always say thin like milk, not thick like a milkshake. If it's like a milkshake, it's just going to glob up in there, and even the clay itself isn't going to pass through that screen very easily. So you want it nice and thin. You may need to add some more water. And then, depending on how much junk is in this, impurities, non-clay material, you may be able to pour it all through at once, or you may have to clean it out several times, which is what I do here. So once I pour it in, I pull it up and I kind of clean it out, and I kind of work the rest of the clay through it, and then I clean out the junk. And you can see, here's the grit that's in this bag. It's just all grit in the bottom at this point. There's a little bit of clay in it, but not much. So I'm going to throw this out. Then I'm going to put that screen back in the bucket, and I'm going to do it again. And I'm going to repeat this about 3 or 4 times to get through all the material. So we used the water to purify this clay, and that worked really good. But now we've got too much water in the clay. I mean, you can't build a pot with this thin clay solution. So we need to try to get water out. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to let it sit here and settle for a couple more hours. And what will happen is that clay will sink to the bottom, and it will leave somewhat pure water on top that I can then pour off. So I ended up running out of daylight. So the next morning I'm coming out, and you can see there's a couple of inches of clear-ish water at the top above that clay layer. And so the first thing I need to do is just pour that off. The problem is, I'm not sure it's done settling, because when I put my hand in this stuff, it's still very thin. Now, my next step is to pour this into a pillowcase. So I'd like it to be thick enough that it's not going to run through the pillowcase, which it can if it's too thin. So I think I'm going to let this sit and settle a little more, see if I can get any more out of it. So I came back later and I poured off, I don't know, a ½ inch of water, not a lot. And then I let it sit for a few more hours, and I came back late in the afternoon and nothing had settled. So I'm sure it's done. You don't have to wait as long as I did here, but you do want to make sure that it's done settling. And again, I want to emphasize that every clay is different. So just what you see here is not going to work the same for your clays necessarily. Now, I tried hanging it from the step ladder and that didn't work. If you can hang it up like from a tree or a ladder or something, that really helps, because then it's not sitting in the water that's running through the case, but it's actually able to dry out more quickly. I don't want to just stick it on the bricks because it's going to make a mess, so I end up putting this little tray underneath of it. This is actually a tray that goes in like a little small dog kennel, but that'll catch that clay and keep it from running all over the place. Now, how fast the clay dries in the pillowcase depends a lot on the weather where you live. It's fall here and the weather is cooler than usual, so it may take a few days to get this dry enough. The next day, I figured out a way to hang that pillowcase from a gate I have, and I just used a vice grip to hold it in place, and then I put a bucket under it just to catch the drips. It's always a challenge at the end knowing when it's time, because if you let it dry too much, then it's a real challenge to re-moisten it. But if you don't dry it enough, then you've just got, piles of gook on your hands and it's hard to deal with. So I'm looking for that sweet spot, and I just don't know, but it's close. It's close enough that we'll go ahead and try it. It's good to come out here and flip it over every once in a while so it doesn't just dry on one side. But I'll go ahead and bring that in. So you can see it's still pretty wet. It's probably going to need some more air drying here on my workbench before it's really, able to be kneaded. It's a little semi-liquid. Catching this stuff at the right stage of dryness can be really difficult sometimes. Now, it's fall right now, so things aren't drying that fast, but when I do this in the summertime here in Tucson, you know, and it's 110 degrees outside, 5% relative humidity, it's really a challenge. You know, you could go to the store or go to work, come back, you know, some hours later and find that it's dried too much while you were away. So that's one of the reasons I avoid wet processing. The other is that it's a little difficult to figure out the right amount of temper to add. So with the dry processing, it was pretty easy. We just did scoops, 4 scoops of dry clay to 1 scoop of sand. That's pretty simple. With this, not quite as simple. You know, you can't do a scoop of this stuff. And it's already got water added, so the volume is off a little as well. So there's different ways to do it. I eyeball it. I just look at, you know, you may not be exact, but I don't think it's really an exact science. Look at the pile and then judge a pile that's about 20%. Think of it as being roughly a quarter, somewhere between a quarter of the lump of clay to a third of the lump of clay, you know, your pile of sand, and then just knead it through. Make sure it's all kneaded through. So I'm going to leave this sit here on my workbench for a while. I'm cleaning it off my hands. And I'm going to come back in a little while and add the temper. Now I've already got the temper ground. This is a ground stone. So when I come back, I'll show you how I guesstimate the amount of temper. I'll knead it through this lump, and then we'll compare this white clay that was wet processed with the red clay I have that was dry processed. Okay, this has been sitting here drying for a few hours. I've come out here a couple times and kind of moved it around, so, you know, because the inside, if you just leave it sit, will stay liquid while the outside dries out. So I've kneaded it a little bit. It's still pretty gooky on the inside, but I think maybe I can work with this. Also, the temper is, of course, dry, and so that's going to soak up some of that moisture and help make the clay more workable. And this is really why I have a problem with, you know, wet processing clay, just because this process is messy, no matter how you slice it. I mean, if you get it out of the pillowcase and it's just a perfect consistency, that's great. I never do, and I've been doing this for a long time. So I'm going to try to, as I said, eyeball the amount of temper and then knead it through here. I think it's going to be a messy process, but stay tuned for the results. We're going to call that good. As I said, really gooky, but the temper is going to help. It's already becoming, you know, kneadable just from the temper that it's taken in, and it hasn't even taken in half of the temper yet. A question I get a lot is, can you add the temper while the clay is wet? Like before it's in the pillowcase, right? Yeah, but it's so liquid when you pour it in there that temper is likely to settle to the bottom. So it won't be evenly distributed through the clay. And you're still gonna have to do a lot of kneading to make sure that temper is evenly distributed. So although you can add the temper early, I'm not sure it's saving you anything. At some point when you're doing this, it almost feels like you've got too much temper and it's never gonna all mix in, but if you keep at it, you will get there. Now I've got most of that temper picked up by the clay. There's only a few little small areas with temper remaining that's not in the body. Of course, it's not still evenly distributed, so it's still gonna take a little bit of kneading. And then what I do is I feel it to see if it's suitably gritty. If not, I add a little more. So that's kind of subjective and something you learn with experience. I think it's okay, but I think because this is a sticky clay, it could use a little more. Okay, that does it. We should have 2 really good clays here for making pottery with. Now, they're gonna have different textures, but that's not because of the way they were processed. That's because they're different clay bodies. They have very different properties, just naturally. And that's one thing you need to learn about wild clay, and that is that every clay is going to be different. So you're going to have to test it, try it, take it all the way through the firing stage, see how it works out. Maybe go back to the drawing board and find something else because it doesn't work out. Or maybe, you find a good one. But it's going to take a lot of testing because every clay is different. With the information in this video, you should be able to go all the way from the wild clay, the native material, all the way through the finished product and have something suitable for making pots out of. If you'd like to take that next step and learn how to fire your pot without a kiln out in the wilds, I've got some videos about that, and I'll link one of them up right over here so you can go check that out. Learn how to take that pot you've made from wild clay and get it fired without using any special expensive equipment. I appreciate you watching today. I'll catch you next time.